be here with Aminatta Forna, an acclaimed novelist who's written many, many books and a memoir. And her most recent fiction is Happiness, and we'll be discussing that this afternoon. And we'll be getting into some of the details of the novel, but I'd like to do that gradually as opposed to giving you a quick précis of what actually happens in the book. I think all you need to know is that most of it is set in London of the recent present, and we'll get into the details of the characters momentarily. But I suppose I'd like to start with a very basic question about the novel concerning its impetus and its generation. What was the spark that led to it? On the one hand, there is a character named Attila who had appeared in a previous book of yours in less developed form. But was it the character, or was it rather perhaps some of the ideas behind and that within the novel that drove you to begin it and begin constructing and designing it?
Well, hello, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for coming to listen to this conversation, which I'm looking forward to. It's always hard sometimes to track things back, isn't it? Because I carry ideas around for a long time. Almost like a sort of pebble in my pocket. I carry an idea around and then, you know, get another pebble, and then you kind of think, it's just feeling like something. So Attila, the main character in Happiness, who is a psychiatrist and a West African, first appeared in a novel that I published in 2010 called The Memory of Love. And he was a small character, a minor character in that book. And I ended up in 2018 publishing a new book with him as the main character. But the trajectory was this, that I remember very distinctly giving a talk to a room full of people about this size. And at the end, somebody asked a question, and they mentioned Attila. And they said, well, you know, the guy who's head of the mental institute in the country, which was Sierra Leone, and they said, you know, Attila, that awful man. And I said, awful? And I said, no. And I didn't see Attila this way at all. That was one thing. But secondly, you know, I said, but you don't know what happened to him. Well, of course they don't, because it wasn't in the book. But I know, you know, as we construct characters, even if we don't use all the material, we know how that character has arisen, and we know what the trajectory of that character's life has been. A whole life exists before the 1.5 pages he turns up in a novel. So, you know, I mean, that was one moment. Then there was another moment where there was a passage in the book, and in which Attila appeared, and this was his key role in the book, in The Memory of Love, that my readers, there were two very different interpretations of the same passage. And the passage concerned trauma and an understanding of what trauma was and wasn't. And I became really interested in the fact that what seemed clear, and it wasn't just readers, but also there was a discussion between two academics about it, who both took the opposing positions. It became clear that everybody who came from a developing country thought it meant one thing, and everybody who came from a Western country thought it meant another thing. So this, to me, was a fascinating theme to mine. I come from both worlds, you see, but I had failed to anticipate this. So this seemed a fascinating theme to mine. You know, how had one group of people arrived at a way of thinking about trauma that was completely at odds, or different anyway, from the way another group of people. So it seemed to be a way to start talking about, to bring Attila back as a vehicle for talking about that, and change his location. So he had, and we could talk about this in a moment, I'll finish with this thought here. The whole of the Memory of Love had taken place in Sierra Leone, as had my previous two books were located in Sierra Leone. I felt like I had written enough about Sierra Leone. I think the Sierra Leoneans felt so too. So I very much wanted to write about the West. So I decided that I would bring Attila to London.
So that was accidental, well, or maybe not accidental, because the novel is a great novel of London, and a great London novel. It just happens to be these characters who are situated in it, and the city is around them and informs them, and it's something that you feel as a reader.
Well, it's interesting because it has been called the next London novel or the new London novel, and I certainly did not say to myself when I began I'm going to write the next London novel. But in the sense that for me as a writer, the physical environment of my characters is so important. I genuinely believe that our environment, the place in which we're raised, whether it's rural, whether it's urban, whether it's hot, whether it's cold, whether it's, you're in a developing country with few facilities or a Western country with, hot and cold running water, really affects the way in which character is developed. So, setting would always have been important to me. It's just that I chose London, and therefore it became thought of as a London novel.
Well, it's interesting as well because simply because Jonathan Coe had spoken recently, and in his novel Middle England, there's the representation of this other London, this other England, in fact, the Merry England, the one where people do coexist and live alongside one another, and it's beautifully represented as well as the flip side, given that it's set in recent years. But I want to talk a little bit more about character, and there's tremendous care and craftsmanship that has gone into the development, in particular, of Jean, one of the main characters, and Attila, the one that you've just mentioned. And I think it's impressive because on the one hand, it's its depth, the depth of these different characters. Over the course of reading the novel, you begin to you get to know them pretty well, pretty intimately, and this, despite, and I put the word "despite" in quotes, the fact that they are coming from very distant and different backgrounds, precisely the difference that you discussed earlier. One of them from Ghana, the other one from Massachusetts in the United States, different education, different temperament, different kinds of backgrounds, and your readings of them seems to penetrate very authentically to deep levels of their existence. And so I'm curious if, I would love to hear you speak about the delights as well as some of the challenges of bringing these two into the world. And maybe bringing into the world is not quite the right word for Attila because he already existed, but it still wasn't this Attila, who is a wonderful character, a wonderful bon vivant, somebody who loves to eat, loves to dance, a connoisseur, but also confident, intellectual, and not from the West. Somebody who, like as you mentioned, straddles both cultures.
Well, when I create a character, I don't use myself. I know people think writers do, and I guess it's all filtered through us. So in the sense the self is always there, but I generally go and do the thing that my character does. So for Attila, when I wrote The Memory of Love, which had a surgeon, I don't know why I did this, it was quite hard work, had a surgeon and a psychologist. I spent a lot of time in an operating theatre with surgeons, and I also spent, and I haven't found a way to say this which doesn't sound strange, I spent some time in a mental institution. So I do the thing they do, and so the character of Attila and the psychologist called Adrian Lockhart, who appeared in The Memory of Love, really came out of doing the thing that they do. And I find that the character changes hugely once I get an idea, let's have this guy, let's make him a psychologist. Actually, Adrian had appeared in a previous book, so I do have a habit of plucking people out of something else and putting them into a new book. But once I've really begun to think about the character, I go and do the thing that they do, and I find that the character changes a great deal. I'll give you an example. In The Hired Man, I had a character called Duro, and Duro becomes a sniper. And so I went to learn to shoot high-velocity rifles, which it turned out I was okay at. And the reason I wasn't brilliant at it is because I simply lacked the level of patience that's required, and I'm a fidgeter. So what I learned, I had a instructor who was a former police marksman. And I told him what I was doing. And what I love about this kind of thing is usually the people that you're with who do the job are very helpful. They say, okay, you know, he'd do this, he'd have this is what he'd have in his pockets, this is what, you know. So one of the things he told me after I'd just taken a shot was he said, you know, that the American Olympic sharpshooting team had brought in one of those specialist coaches, not somebody who knows how to do the thing, but somebody who knows how to observe you at your best and figure out what it is that you do that you know, when you score the most points, what is the sequence of actions that you have taken that produces that score. And what the coach discovered was that these marksmen were so good that without knowing they did it, they pulled the trigger between heartbeats. So this informed the character of Duro. You know, he was not going to be an excitable person. So with Jean, who is the wildlife biologist, I spent some time with wildlife biologists in Western Massachusetts, where Jean comes from. And the one thing I observed about them all, there were two things, the two characteristics they all shared. They were highly independent, right? I mean, possessed of a level of independence. I think of myself as an independent person. I mean, I'm positively clingy compared to them. You know, they were people who would go out into the wilderness on their own and be entirely self-sufficient for many months at a time. And the second thing about them I discovered was that they found humans really irritating. So I had a friend who's a wildlife biologist, and she has the same quality, right? Exactly the same. I'd known her for years and years in a different part of the world. Has exactly the same quality. Found humans really annoying. I mean, humans' inability just to deal with life as it is. You know, humans always wanting to change life, always wanting to control things, not being able to accept the reality of existence. My friend was so annoyed with humans that one day I was in town in London. You're going to have to forgive my language for this next thought. I was in town in London and I found a little vanity mirror, for, you know, handbag mirror, and it had on the back of it, "Do I look like a fucking people person?" And I bought it for her. So, and you know, she studied chimpanzees, and she even started going off them because they were too much like us. So I noticed these characteristics that, you know, there was just no way Jean wasn't going to have some of that in her, you know, that ability just to walk around London late at night, be unafraid, you know, and get very, she does a radio interview, and she gets very frustrated with the host of the radio show because, they, you know, he and the audience just won't accept the facts as they are.
Well, you've anticipated in some respects my next question, which had to do with the fact that these characters are experts. That they are specialists, that they're highly trained, and they've also acquired a great deal of experience in various actually areas. On the one hand, you could say Attila is somebody who specializes in trauma, in particular those the trauma experienced by civilians, usually in military conflicts, and Jean. On the one hand, there's quite a bit about the work that she does on these garden roofs, greenifying them, as it were, creating green spaces within the urban environment, as well as her background in watching and recording and studying the intrusion or the appearance of, say, coyotes in Massachusetts in an urban area or foxes in London. We'll talk more about that, I think, in a moment. I'm curious, though, in terms of the process, you've already explained that. Okay, yes, you do research on these areas that they specialize in to the extent of actually learning how to fire a rifle. I'm curious how you use that knowledge, because conceptualizing a book and writing it, you know, it's as you said, you have the pebbles in your pocket and they accumulate, and at some point you probably begin sketching and drafting and writing and designing. And what do you do? How does this knowledge, in the case of these characters, Jean and Attila, do you wrap certain bits around the character? Does it help change or develop them? I mean, did you have to do, for example, additional reading about, I assume you did theoretical reading on trauma while thinking about Attila and what somebody like this does professionally?
The Memory of Love dealt in some depth with trauma and resilience, but the interesting thing is that and Happiness returns to the idea of trauma, but explores far more deeply the idea of resilience. So I was quite steeped in that world. Also, you know, all my books have dealt with civil conflict and trauma in one way or another. And it's been a very interesting it's an interesting place to find myself as a writer, because the understanding, the clinical understanding of trauma has been developing while I've been writing. You know, so really, I mean, if you think about the States, United States, the first clinical recognition of trauma was in the 1970s after the Vietnam War. I think in Europe you could take it further back and say it was the First World War, but then it was called shell shock. And actually it was thought to be the proximity to shell fire that caused some kind of nerve damage that then produced what we now call PTSD. But it was really in modern times, it was really in the 70s and 80s that PTSD begins to get recognized, and the thinking has just gone broader, further, deeper. So when I first started writing, I was, you know, my country, Sierra Leone, had just come out of it was in a civil conflict, emerging from a civil conflict. But this had been for a start, it was a civil war, it wasn't an international war, so people were left with each other. At the end of it, you were left with the violators. But the other thing is that the main body of the traumatized people were not combatants, they were civilians. So I began, you know, my interest was really in civilians, how they came out of the trauma of war, whereas most of the research was really on combatants. So that was why I spent time, and I spoke to, there were very few psychologists in Sierra Leone. There's only actually one trained psychologist in the whole country, who was the person who really set off the trajectory of thought for me, because he said, at one point, very early on, he said, you know, these people are going to be okay. And all of the thinking around trauma was the exact opposite. Right, that if something like that had happened to you, you were damaged for life. So I said, really? And he said, yeah, they're going to be okay. And he was the first person I came across who challenged what had then become this orthodoxy around trauma, that if something bad happened to you, you were damaged and therefore you would never be truly happy. He was the first person who said, actually, people overcome these things. The majority of people overcome these things. And he is not Attila, I want to be clear about that, but I'm also clear that I owe him a debt for the creation of Attila. And giving me, you know, putting in place those ideas, it made me start thinking about how can, you know, can a whole country really be traumatized? And so to take a step back to my first answer about the way in which readers from two different worlds had read this one particular passage in the Memory of Love. It was about Attila challenging the very idea that an entire country could be traumatized. 99% of people, an NGO had said, it could have been 99% of people in Sierra Leone suffered PTSD. And you know, all the people from the developing world said, well, no. And people from the you know, industrialized nations took it at face value. The way I've come to think about it now, and I think we probably need a new language around trauma, and what Attila would say, and actually what the original psychiatrist who started me thinking about this, and France's own Boris Cyrulnik, who was a... do you know who Boris Cyrulnik is? Okay. Enough of you do, or should I say? Okay, so Boris Cyrulnik is a French psychiatrist, and his parents were killed in the death camps during the Second World War, and Cyrulnik survived on the streets, of Paris, and joined the resistance when he was very young as a runner. And he grew up, became a psychiatrist and psychologist. And he really, I mean, he wasn't the only person, but he really was at the forefront of developing ideas around resilience. And Boris Cyrulnik went as far as to say, really, that actually people grew in the face of adversity and that there was such a thing as post-traumatic growth. So, you know, so with that passage in The Memory of Love, which, you know, Attila is saying to the British psychologist, no, you know, all these people have suffered, right? That is the clear point. All these people have suffered, but that does not mean that they are all traumatized. In other words, that they are all damaged by it. Most people will recover from a traumatic experience. Some people will not. Some people don't manage to regain their equilibrium after a traumatic experience, and those are the people really that require the intervention of specialists. But most of us can find that, you know, in certain kinds of society, and the society makes a difference. We can talk about that. Who you're surrounded by, the way of thinking that you've grown up with makes a big difference to how you cope with trauma. But this was the genesis of those thoughts.
And let's talk about another one of the genesis of, or at least of the novel, some of these ideas, some of these thoughts, but the title of the panel being Reversing the Gaze. I think it has something to do with bringing Attila up to London and situating him in this world and then narrating it. Of course, his is not the only perspective in the novel, but it is probably the dominant one, or it's a very strong one. This was an intention of yours, I imagine.
Yes, and I call it reversing the gaze. If you are native of any African nation, you will have become aware quite early on of a certain school of literature produced by the West, which is called The White Man in Africa book. So, and it's now sort of slightly got changed to the white savior narrative, and you know, everyone's trying to sort of avoid the white savior narrative. But in The Memory of Love, I actually decided to play with the white savior narrative, and so I took an Englishman to Sierra Leone, where I heaped calamity upon him. And if he does escape in the end, as is the trajectory of that particular story, but he fails to be a savior, and the people of the country eventually have to save him. But what I did in that, because you start off with Adrian as you come into The Memory of Love, and it's his gaze, and then actually about a third of the way into the book, the gaze shifts, and you actually see the country looking back at him. So I played with that in that book, and then when I came to happiness, what I wanted to do was reverse the whole trope entirely and take an African and bring him to Britain and, you know, let him embark on a series of adventures or incidents, but see how through African eyes, through specifically West African eyes, how a European country looked, what was his assessment of that country. So,
somebody who knows, who can distinguish between what are called first and third world problems, right?
Yeah,
whereas
exactly.
many of the people in the country cannot.
Yes,
right?
that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, you said it.
Well, I wonder if you could maybe discuss that perspective a little bit more. Obviously, that what makes it, and actually, no, I wanted to talk about a scene that occurs very on as an instance of what this change in the gaze can represent, and why it's also refreshing as a reader to encounter. There's this moment in a restaurant towards the beginning of the novel where Attila, who has been in London often, and he knows what he wants, and he goes to a restaurant to eat, and it's a fairly exclusive location, and he realizes that there's one black couple in the restaurant. And this is just a line in the novel, but there's this one, in the way that gestures can be bottomless.
So this is the nod.
Yeah.
So
the nod.
Here's the thing. I sort of thought people knew about the nod. And I sometimes asked white people, do you not know about the nod? So what happens is if a black person encounters another black person in a place, we nod. Right? And it was just like, I see you, you nod. And sometimes I go somewhere and people say, oh, do you know that man? And I say, no, but we nod. So what happens is Attila goes into the restaurant. I mean, London, you know, the nod doesn't happen so much because it's a sort of critical mass of people of colour. But there are certain locations in which you give a little nod. And so he goes into this restaurant, and everybody in the restaurant is white, so he gives a little nod to the black guy who goes past him on his way to the bathroom. When I now teach at Georgetown University in the States, and my white colleagues are kind of surprised that when I walk through the university, the janitors nod at me, the delivery men nod at me, the black professor nods at me, we all nod. And I was kind of surprised that white people don't do this. I mean, even apparently, I said to my husband, who's white, you don't ever nod. And my husband traveled all the time, and he'd go to India, China, and I said, if you're the only white person in the room and there's another white person, do you not nod at them? And my husband said, oh no, because you want to think you're the only one. But we don't want to be the only one. But that is about that different experience of moving through the same place and seeing different things. So one of the things that a lot of critics in Britain said was that I wrote about the London that nobody else noticed. And I thought, who? I go through London noticing the doorman all the time. And also, you know, parakeets and foxes. Because the book's a lot, we'll talk about that in a minute, won't we? The urban wildlife in the city. But thinking about the people in the city, you know, my eyes rest in a different place. I probably don't notice investment bankers as they walk past me.
No nod.
But I do notice the doorman of the hotel, because the doorman of the hotel probably notices me. And we nod. And here's, when you ask about where some of these ideas developed, I was on tour in America, and I go city to city to city to city. And a lot of the time, the people who work in the restaurants will be, in the hotels, will be from West Africa, if not specifically from Sierra Leone, they're West African. So they see my name, and then they start extending to me little special courtesies. You know, they will, they'll keep the restaurant open for me. You know, it's like, I mustn't take a taxi to the airport. They'll get one of their sons to drive me. Poor guy has to get up at 6 in the morning to take me to the airport. But in DC, when I now live, I was out one night drinking. I was out one night drinking with a friend of mine. And it was time to go home at 1 o'clock in the morning, so he hailed a taxi for me. And I got in the taxi, and I gave the man my address. And he said, I know where you live. I've driven you before. He said, you are Aminatta from Sierra Leone with the Scottish mother. And he said, I am Mohammed from the Cameroons. Does your husband know you're out with that man? So we live in this, you know, well, the connections that I make in places are not necessarily the connections other people make in places. And so that was the world that I brought to London, is what I see. And what I don't notice is, I don't have much of a sense of, I have no sense of direction. And I do not notice architecture. My husband really notices architecture. I don't even notice it. But I will notice if there's a bird's nest on the 4th floor balcony. So, you know, it's a way of seeing, and my way of seeing is informed by what I'm interested in, but also who sees me.
We'll get to that bird's nest in a moment, or the fox's nest. But I do hope you'll indulge me, because I'd like to read this very short passage from the novel, the one that she's just been describing. With the exception of a couple seated at one of the water lilies, everyone in the restaurant was white. Attila watched the single black couple for a while. They were young and close in conversation. The woman wore a fuchsia dress, the man was in a suit. An anniversary, thought Attila, and looked away. Some minutes later, as Attila was eating brown shrimp, the man walked past Attila's table, and a few minutes later, on his way back from the gents, he passed by again. This time, Attila happened to look up and catch his eye. And that's the essential part, right? Catching the eye. The man nodded, a single dip of the chin. Attila nodded back and returned to his shrimp. The nod was something that was exchanged only in certain places. Moscow, for example. Perth, Prague, Sao Paulo, no. Havana, no. Mumbai, Yes. Rome, less and less often. All of Poland, much of England beyond the M25. Belfast, yes. In London, more rarely, although a nod might be exchanged in certain kinds of establishment. In this restaurant, Attila drew no stairs, but it was still a place the nod might occur. So that degree of specificity and extraordinary. Let's talk about the importance of animals to the narrative, to the story. Foxes in particular, I think in some respects that this is what Jean is doing, is studying the appearance, recording the appearance of foxes. She has a background, she's come from Massachusetts where she's done something similar with coyotes in the past. And what drew you to the example, to this particular instance? Is it just London life and that there has been this profusion in recent years that it came to your awareness by way of that? Or is this, it seems like if you were seeing nests all the time, then this is simply part of your experience of the city. But what made you want to write about it and integrate it into this narrative?
I'd been thinking about it for a while, but I'd never really found a reason. But you know, London has a very large urban fox population. It's very hard to go a day in London without seeing a fox. And you know, even during the daytime, once you know what you're looking at, and this is also, you know, the gaze, you know, the specificity of a particular person's gaze. I think other people think they're dogs or don't, you know, or just not really paying attention. But actually in the middle of the day, you'll see a fox walking with the commuters as they go home. A fox would just be poodling up the pavement. So I grew up, I bought a house in a particular part of London, and when we moved in, somebody said to us, "Oh, the vixen has her cubs in your garden." And we tidied up the garden, but the vixen, and it must have been different vixens at different times because we lived there for 18 years, would always have her cubs very nearby. And I would write, you know, all the other books I've written were written looking out of the window, watching fox cubs grow up in my garden. So I was always very taken by that, this wildness in the city, and particularly the ability of these animals to adapt to that environment. And the more I read, this is over many years, the more I read about foxes in the city, I realized that actually the city had become, they were so well adapted to the city, it actually was creating a bigger fox population. There were many more foxes in the city than there were outside. And also at that time in Britain, the fox hunting ban was had gone through. And people began to think that the reason there were foxes in the city was because of the fox hunting ban, and there was now this sort of proliferation of foxes. But actually the reason foxes are in the city is because of us. And in particular, it's because of fast food. It's because we drop the food on the ground, and so the whole of London is this wonderful buffet for many kinds of wildlife. And what I really liked about that, the more I began to think about it, the more I sort of rather enjoyed the idea, and this is where wildlife biologists get so impatient, is humans' inability to accept that their behavior is what has created something. So I thought, you know, we build a city, we then bring in fast foods, we then drop our litter, and we create a chain of events that we don't want to take responsibility for. But we want somebody to answer that. And what, you know, in Britain, though, constant sort of flare-ups in the media. You know, fox does something, and then, you know, but fox, I don't know, kills somebody's terrier, and very, very, very occasionally bites a child. And then there's a call for foxes to be culled, to be killed in large numbers. And people are very divided over the foxes. Some people support them, and some people hate them. And when I moved to the States, where I now teach at Georgetown, I went as a visiting professor a couple of times. And the discussion around urban wildlife is more tense even than it is in the UK, partly because their wildlife is bigger. I mean, they have bears and moose. But also, the coyote is the creature that most mirrors the fox. It's a canid. It has been able to adapt to the urban environment the way that the fox has. All of the attempts, the Americans were hugely, the early settlers were hugely vengeful and successful in eradicating wolves, but their attempts to eradicate coyote have been completely hopeless. And the coyotes just keep winning and keep winning and keep winning, whatever you do to the coyote population. So this also became really a metaphor for me to resilience as well, that these animals just kept on adapting. They just kept on adapting, whatever it was. And one of the wildlife biologists said to me, if you live in Chicago or Boston, you are never more than 100 meters from a coyote. And I just thought that was just amazing, that for all that humans think we are and have achieved, we can't outsmart this creature. But anyway, it sort of became for me really a vehicle to talk about resilience, really, and a vehicle to talk about migration, because coyotes began in, you have to stop me once I start on coyotes. Coyotes began as desert creatures in the western states of America. And they have, first of all, they traveled north into freezing temperatures, then they traveled east, and then they traveled down. So they've now inhabited the eastern seaboard. So this is a creature that began in the Californian desert, has now adapted itself to be able to survive Boston winters. And then even there are coyote living on the islands of the eastern seaboard, and no one can figure out how they got there. The tide never goes low enough. How did they get there? Did they get on someone's boat? I mean, so for me, it was a real way of talking about adaptability, migration, resilience, so many of the things that I was interested in bringing into the novel.
I would just add to that it's not even just coyotes and foxes that this phenomenon has been thoroughly seen by you, that we have a whale in the Thames at one point, that we have a seal, and that, of course, the question of these parrots who show up, and this happens in Paris as well as London, right?
And no one knows how the parakeets got there. So I asked somebody, I had two stories in London, right? One story is that James Bond, they were filming a James Bond movie in the studios, not Elstree, but the one in South London, I forget the name, but they were filming a James Bond movie, I think it was Moonraker, and they were creating a jungle scene inside the studio, and somebody opened the studio doors, and all of the birds that they'd brought in, all these birds of paradise flew out, right? That's one theory. The other theory is that these are escaped household pets. I told this wildlife biologist in America the theories, and she said, oh, that's funny. We have the James Bond story too, but it's not James Bond, it's Petco, which is a pet company, and that they were transporting a large number of parakeets, and somebody accidentally left the gate to the cage open, and all the parakeets flew out. And then they've also got its individual creatures. But again, these are Argentinian green parakeets. Here's a creature that has adapted itself so well to a place that it never supposedly should have been. That we find parakeets in North America, in London, and in Paris and all sorts of places, and they excite the same degree of animosity, but also the same degree of love. But isn't this what humans have done? Humans are a naturally migratory animal. We act now as though migration is this brand new activity on the part of humans, but humans have always migrated, have always moved, have always adapted. Everybody in this audience began in Africa, and somehow migrated north and, adapted to these different landscapes. So, migration is in the blood of all living organisms.
Yeah, well, and the reaction of certain Londoners who are less informed than Jean is also built into the novel, and that reaction is one of indignation and fear, which has its parallel, of course, vis-a-vis the other, and in this case that of another species, but there's this other narrative in the text also about, in terms of immigration, some of the things that can happen there. That's so that involves humans as well, that the fear is paralleled in both respects.
Can we talk about fear, though? Because I've never really known if it's fear that's at the bottom of these kinds of feelings of aggression. I mean, because if it was fear, I should be the most scared, you know, so, and the most aggressive. I think it's about control rather than fear. And I think that, if you ask people, what is it really about foxes that you worry about, they'll say all these things. Well, they might attack my children, will they do this, will they do that? And I'll say, how many times have you actually known this happen? And you find out they haven't known it happen at all.
In the same way that the places where people are most afraid of migrants are like Slovakia, where there are
where it
two,
hasn't happened. So I think sometimes a narrative arises which is used to justify an aggression. Right, the narrative is created to justify the original aggression, but the original aggression is really about control. It's about maybe control of resources or control of space or the desire for power. But I don't think it really comes from fear, other than you can say a fear of losing control. But I think the narrative of fear, which is exactly what we do with, specifically now, immigrants, is the newspapers concentrate on crimes, committed by. I mean, look at what Trump is doing, is categorizing Mexicans as rapists and criminals, and that then is used as the justification for something else. But was the fear there? No, because Mexicans have coexisted with Americans in the United States for centuries already.
Well, the other parallel, I think, is that there is, as in the case of foxes, there is no simple solution, and many of these people are not interested in the counterintuitive, or maybe things that seem less intuitive consequences. I take it for granted that this is a fact, that that foxes will reproduce more quickly. Could you say maybe something about that? Because this was one of the surprises in the novel.
Right.
Reading it, I assume there's a lot of information that's not so much smuggled into it, but that it's built into the characters themselves. And if I'm not a wildlife biologist, and these things are very interesting to read about, because, and she has to get, and again, you have a complicated problem, and on a radio show, somebody only wants the simple solution, and it's almost impossible to articulate that there is no simple path.
I think with, generally speaking, and it has got, I suppose, worse now with social media. I don't know. I mean, maybe social media's just given a different kind of platform, but politically, we seem to want very simple solutions to very complicated answers, and no politician wins by saying, well, it's really very complicated. So what happens with foxes and coyote? If you try to eradicate them, they hyperproduce. Right? If you bring the population down, they will start having more litters, and so they will have. The turnover will be faster, and the litters will be larger. But then, if you look at humans, what do humans do? What's the baby boom? Right? After the war, we had more children faster. So actually, life is geared to reproduce itself and to create, to keep surviving. We are geared to survive. But it is that, so what Jean encounters is in trying to explain this, on a radio show to the host, look, the best thing we can do with foxes is just leave them alone and adapt our behavior to the fact that they're in the city, because that's actually ultimately going to be the best result for everybody. The call-ins from the public are people who are getting very frustrated with that, and they want to sort of pile on the pressure on Jean. They come up with more and more accusations of what foxes have done in order to try to justify their culling. And Jean, as I say, like all the wildlife biologists I know, and not very different from Attila in his field, desperately wants people to accept the reality of life, not the ideal of life, but the reality of life.
And there's a connection to resilience, of course, in these different examples as well. Yeah. We do have time for questions from the public. So, Max in the second row.
Hello. Actually, I had two questions to you. And the first one is like you're making the comparison between the foxes and maybe the migrants. This is how it sounds in my ears, and I wanted to know what then about some species of animals that are completely disappearing. Do you think that it might happen to the humanity? The second question is about actually migration. Today we know that in Western countries, the population is aging. Like there are more and more really old people, and then in the South, in Africa particularly, we have a lot of young people, and the demography, like, you know, a lot of young people, and they don't have, as far as they don't have any opportunity in their countries, in their continent, in their homeland, they're almost forced to go away, to go in the north, to go in the Western countries. Do you think that with time going on, we are going to have something like a replacement of population?
So the first question was about animals and humans, well, actually just species of life and extinction. Is that right? And of course, that has happened to humans, as we know. You know, in Native Americans, South American indigenous peoples, Aboriginal people in Australia. I mean, all over the world, human populations have been disappearing because of migration. And in those cases, of course, originally of migration from Europe to those countries. And the indigenous people did not survive it, you know, because of measles and smallpox and all kinds of things, and because of deliberately being wiped out by incomers. So it does. So the parallel continues. You know, the parallel is possible. It's possible to extend that parallel in both cases, to both cases. In terms of the populations of the southern countries moving into the north and being more youthful, and it's very interesting. Before I became a writer, I was a journalist, and I worked for the BBC, and I did a lot of political reporting. And what was evident was the lie at the heart of the discussion around immigration. So politicians would say to us, off the record, they would admit to basically the fact we need these people, we have to replace a certain part of the population. That's exactly what employers said. You know, they said, well, there was a skills shortage as much as anything else, but there was also this labor shortage. But that's not what politicians would say publicly. They would not say that. So you know, the belief that any of the northern countries don't need people from the southern countries has been allowed to persist. And, you know, and happiness speaks to that. It's like, you know, we just have to be real about this. You know, unless you're going to try to create an artificial population boom in the northern countries, it's going to happen some way. But what I would say about this is that there are flows of migration in all different ways. I mean, so the next big flow of migration that's anticipated by economists, which is already starting to happen, is young people from Western countries going to the BRIC nations to look for work, going to Brazil, places like Brazil and India. There's already a migratory flow out of the United Kingdom to India to look for jobs. So I think we're going to see many different kinds of flows. Not that long ago, I read a piece in one of the papers about the fact there were 40,000 Portuguese in Angola. because Portugal had been through an economic dip and they had gone that way. And if you look at where the real emerging economies are, they're actually in the African countries, and there's a migratory flow back to the African countries. If you do certain kinds of jobs, they can be the best place to be. I mean, if you're a road engineer, you're much better off in working, you'll find more work in a country with a developing economy than you will somewhere like here.
That's to say nothing of the Chinese.
Oh yeah, the Chinese flow into Africa is significant, and that, of course, is about food security. So there are many different reasons people move, and very many different migratory patterns, and some may be less welcome than others, but I think we have to accept the reality of it. We may also have to manage it. I'm not saying that these things never have to be managed. I'm simply saying that we have to recognize the complexity, that our whole world is in constant flux, and our whole world is going to stay in constant flux.
We were talking about foxes, and I was wondering if ever you had been interested in turning those foxes into kind of characters, human characters kind of thing. Would you, like La Fontaine did them? I mean, are you interested in that literary vein to transform the animals into characters that start to talk between themselves? And I mean, there's some kind of phantasmagoric way. Are you interested in that vein?
I mean, I love to read that sort of book, but I'm not sure if my literary imagination extends far enough to be able to do it myself. I turned the animals into characters, but still, they still remained animals. I didn't give them voices, and I didn't give them interiority, but I did turn them into characters in terms of how they related to Jean and Jean's affection for them. Because, how she began to, there's a scene quite early in the book where Jean has to fell a coyote. She's got to dart a coyote. And wildlife biologists are quite careful about ever allowing themselves to admit to feelings of emotions around animals. And Jean, what she does is she goes up to the coyote, which is now fast asleep, and she has to collar it, remove the dart, give the antidote, collar it. And at one moment, she actually puts her nose into the creature's fur, which is kind of interesting because some people read it very differently from the way I intended it. Some people said it was a scene about sex. It wasn't. No. I said, if somebody hands you a puppy, what do? You turn it over and you smell it. I mean, everyone I know who likes dogs, I mean, if you don't like dogs, of course you don't do that. But everyone I know who likes dogs, if they handed a small puppy, turn it over and you sniff it. So, so sort of what she does with the coyote. But for me, it was this transformation where she and the animal began to have a direct connection. She, with all the animals who are her study creatures, begin to have that connection. And so I've written about that. And I think these animal-human relationships are as real as human-human relationships. But no, I haven't yet turned... I wrote a kid's book like that. Actually, I wrote a kid's book like that for a charity called The Angel of Mexico City, where all the stray dogs have their own characters. I did do it in a kid's book, and then, of course, it's a long history of it happening in kids' books. But I haven't yet thought about doing it in an adult book. Maybe.
But I'm guessing that one of the unforeseen consequences of this novel is that now you are going to receive a tweet or an email or a book. Every single instance of Fox as character is going to be sent your way.
I have a lot of Fox memorabilia sent to me by people who've enjoyed the book. I've got mugs with foxes on them, pictures of foxes, postcards with foxes, little T-shirts with foxes, badges with foxes. It's kind of interesting. But what's also interesting is no coyote, right? No coyote. And I think the reason is that the coyote has never achieved the place in the public imagination that the fox has achieved. And it's the reason that you're talking about is that actually foxes have entered, they entered literature, they've entered popular culture. In a way that coyotes do in Native American culture, but they haven't really entered Western cultural thinking the way that the fox has. But I do have an awful lot of fox memorabilia, that's true.
one last question.
Could you, first of all, thank you very much. I mean, it really made me want to read your books, all of them. Can you come back to the idea of resilience and the difference between, if I understood right, first world or Western countries? And I mean, do you think that, you know, on the one hand, our children who are really mollycoddled and everything, compared to even someone who had to leave Africa, had this very traumatic journey to Europe, young people who had all these horrible things, but in the end, they will be more resilient and they will survive better and they will be stronger. Is that did I
It's a highly likely outcome, is how I'd say. Yes, I mean, I think there was already an anxiety about the fact that our generation coddle our children too much. And it really did come out of, you know, the ideas of therapy, that if bad things happened to you in childhood, you wouldn't be a happy adult. So we've all got over-anxious about it. And it's not even just between people who come from, you know, poor and relatively underdeveloped countries. It's generational, too. If you look at our parents, you know, and my Scottish ancestry, you know, they lived on the Shetland Islands, you know, and salted herring and came over. So that, you know, they had that robustness of approach is also mirrored in earlier generations, as it is, you know, in the way that you see it in people from developing countries. So what, you know, what. I mean, in the two existing schools of thought, but in psychiatry and psychology, among mental health professionals, you know, are those people who would endlessly extend the definition of trauma, and those people who are now saying it's gone too far and we have to take it back, and that suffering is not trauma, and that we are in danger of categorizing everything as trauma, of creating a narrative which says, oh, you're going to be damaged if something happens to you. And therefore, in fact, it's called looping. You start to create what you originally intended simply to describe. So, you know, I don't quite know what to do. I mean, I'm raising a son in you know, in a safe environment in Northern Virginia. I don't really feel like heaping calamity upon him, but I think that one can create a sense of, you know, I think we can teach our children to accept the fact that they are not going to be immune to suffering. Bad things will happen to you. And this, in a way, is what I tried to get Attila to put his finger on. At one point he says, you know, that suffering is unavoidable, and the difference between, let's say, the African and the European, or indeed my great-grandmother, you know, and our generation is, she knew that, right? She knew it was unavoidable, therefore she was already braced for it, and it didn't therefore inform the rest of her life. And we have somehow created this quite extraordinary narrative where not just, you know, the whole of modern culture has created this narrative that you can somehow get through life unscathed. And you can't get through life unscathed. If nothing else happens, your parents will die, right? If you never go to war, if you never go hungry, you know, if nothing else happens, your parents will one day die. So you are going to know grief and you are going to know suffering. And isn't it better that we know that before, as we go forward?
And on that note, I'd like to let you know that Happiness, as well as much of Aminatta's backlist, is available upstairs in French and in English. And so I'd encourage you all to pick up a copy and have it signed. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the interpreters for rendering this conversation into French. Thank you very much. Aminatta, thank you all for coming.